All right, this will be our week 6 video for the film The Personals. This film is made in 1998. I believe I put 99 in the syllabus, so I apologize for that. So we're jumping forward by about a decade from The Terrorizers that we just finished. We're about 4 years after Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. So Type A will look pretty similar to what you saw in Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. I don't think, as far as I can think, we don't see so much of the city in that way in this film, but we will see this character on a lot of these buses going back and forth between her home and a tea house where she meets men who are answering her ad that she put in the personal section to find a man to marry. And so we'll see that she's an ophthalmologist and she quits her job when she decides to embark on this new task of finding a husband. So we'll see her in the same tea house. She says she likes to move from table to table depending on her mood. We'll learn more about that. We'll see all sorts of different men that show up to meet her, different ages, different kinds of occupations. I'm interested to see what you think about some of the ways that some of these men are represented. I think as a film made a long time ago, I think we'll probably see some things, again, as we've said a bunch of times in this class, we wouldn't do anymore probably in a film. I think there's some classism that comes out pretty clearly, different kinds of ableism that comes out pretty clearly. I think the film is judgmental in certain ways of different kinds of men. When each of the men shows up on screen in Chinese, it shows their name and their occupation, and we don't usually get the translation. We don't get the translation on the screen, but in the conversations, it always will. If it's important, it'll always come out what they do, and so don't worry about that so much. But you will see that on the screen every time these men show up. And I think it'll be interesting to see these different men, again, of different ages, different backgrounds, and they have different ideas of Dr. Wu here, as we'll get to know her. They have different ideas, I think, of what she's done here by putting this ad in the paper. And I think they look at her in different ways. So I think that'll be pretty interesting. She doesn't say she's a doctor, so I think that's an interesting part of this story. We'll definitely learn a lot more about her as the story goes on. And so some of it is very silly and some of it is very goofy and very light. Some of it's really serious. It gets pretty heavy towards the end as we start to learn more and more about her life. There are several cameos that I think don't really add very much to the film, especially if we don't know who these people are. But there is a famous politician who our character here meets in a restaurant just by chance, I guess. There's a famous actor that shows up. There's a rock musician that we meet. I don't think they add much to the story. I don't know if the director is showing off like I know these famous people or something. But if you can see some significance in those parts, then please, please let me know. But we're back to the same question of a male director making a film about, largely about or totally about women in the modern world. So I think this once again gives us a pretty interesting opportunity to consider that picture. Yeah, I guess that's probably good on this film. And so there are a couple of main readings I think are will be helpful in understanding this. And so there's a chapter from the Liu book, My Fight for a New Taiwan. And so in this chapter 6, and we're in her book, we're still kind of behind the timeline of where we are in these films, but this chapter is about her time in prison in the 80s. And so she does something like 5.5 years for sedition and her involvement in those protests, those human rights protests. It's pretty interesting, I think, to see how she's treated as a political prisoner, as a woman, the kind of cruelty that I think they pretty clearly designed for a person in her position. And I think we've talked a lot about her having a lot of, pretty serious grudge towards the Nationalist Party. the article that was assigned for this coming week by Cheng on, so I think it's actually it's a chapter from her book. The book is called Women's Movements in 20th Century Taiwan. And this is a chapter called The Autonomous Women's Movement and Feminist Discourse in the Post-Martial Law Era. So we just talked about martial law today in class. It ends in 1987. So in other words, we're talking about the late 80s into the 90s, early 2000s in this chapter by Cheng. And I think you'll recognize, and that Cheng mentions Lu a couple times, as this very, very important person in the history of feminism in Taiwan. But she goes through a lot of the major steps that take place once martial law is over. And as we talked about in class, there's not that sense that you could get locked up for anything, anything disruptive, anything that is outside of the ordinary. That conformity that the KMT was really insisting on for 40 years is now over. And so it's a really good chapter. We'll see different parts of the women's movement. So trying to expose gender bias in textbooks and to correct it. And what's really interesting about Taiwan is I think that these things happen pretty fast. And so I think I always seem to think that there are questions in our country, in our society, that take a long time, and somehow we're still talking about the same thing, decades and decades and decades later. And one thing that's always struck me about Taiwan is how fast things happen. And so I got there in 1991, martial law was over, but there were still people who were kind of touchy about talking about history. And I've always thought it was a real honor to be there and to see, the first free elections, happening before my eyes, and to see these great steps. And so anyway, this chapter by Cheng really captures that with regard, again, to these different parts of the women's movement. So gender bias in textbooks, women's studies in universities, organizations for divorced women, allowing women to organize and find company and try to get out of the discrimination and kind of marginalization that divorced women would have faced before that moment. Changing unequal family laws that were very, very biased towards men in terms of property and children's custody. And so these things are all happening in the late 80s, the early 90s. The debate over licensed prostitution that takes place during this time, that gets pretty interesting. The discussion isn't so long, but you definitely get a sense of the different kinds of feminist arguments, both for and against licensed prostitution, and these interesting moments where prostitutes are demonstrating and they're marching in favor of their jobs. And anyway, so those are several elements then of this autonomous women's movement and the feminist discourse chapter. And so I would want you then, as we're watching this film and thinking about this film, that this character, I think she's right around probably 30 years old or so, maybe early 30s. So she's definitely come of age, gone to college, gone to medical school. She's a woman in this modern city in the moment that's described in the Cheng chapter. And so I think we'll see her in really interesting ways talk about her, really express a dignity. And she seems to be always kind of shocked when men question her and men wonder why she'd put an ad in the paper. So anyway, so I think that's probably all I need to say about this film. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be showing it this Friday. It's on Asian Crush. Again, if you get the subscription, you can watch without ads, which is what I've been doing. It was on Amazon until just like the last week or so, and it vanished from Amazon, but it is on Asian Crush. So thank you, Asian Crush. All right, see you soon. Bye.